Okay, let's do some floating and positioning, and actually have a little look at Flexbox while we're here. This is your assignment, which you can download from Moodle. I would suggest you take a look at it, and or maybe even print it out and have it next to you. However, mostly you're probably going to just want to play along with me and do this exercise as I do it. And listen to me, I'm afraid. Here we go. Yes, make a project folder, I guess. Sure, that's fine. But the key thing is a root folder, float, and your name would be fine. Could be first or last name, whatever. And download into that folder two things: float exercise and JAC-600.jpg, an image supposedly of me. So we got two things in the root folder there. And when you open up the HTML document in Notepad++, I have multiple ones open, and I don't want that one. I want this one. And it's going to look like this. It should look something like this. What do we got here? Well, I've used this file a few different times. It's just supposedly a resume kind of file here, right? I have these two groups of lists of links here. Ignore those for now. That's for later on. We're going to look at, again, we're going to look at some initial navigation ideas, which you're going to have to start thinking about navigation for your site soon. There will be a navigation lesson, but I want you to see these already, and you might take from them enough ideas to maybe start your own, or wait, at least familiarize yourself with it. Then we got a paragraph. We got some text here which is contact text, right? Not sure what that's doing there. We got some more paragraphs. Then we have something called paragraph left and right. We're going to make those go left and right. Then we have what would be a footer area, which I've just highlighted so you can see it. And then I've got something called warning here, which I don't know why it's down there. And we actually have two more paragraphs down below the footer, which is unusual, but I separated them because these are using a different technology to make them go left and right, the Flexbox, so I wanted you to see it separately. So that's all that's going on here. And if we look at the HTML, you'll see, actually, if you look in the file, you see a lot of CSS is going on already, but nothing unusual there. And the normal kind of styling. Then I have something here that says floating positioning begins here. Good. We'll be working in this area, and we'll be using these selectors as I've already given you. And then we have something which says flex columns. Wow, what's that? We'll deal with that later. And we have some navigation stuff, which I can see is commented out right now. So there's comment codes around it. See, the comment opens there, and the comment closes there. And each chunk of those is two different chunks of navigation code. And we will look at those later on also. First thing I want you to do is go down into the HTML, ignore again this area with the links here. I want you to go to this area which says, which one has a span, this paragraph. There's a span with an ID of Jack. And let's put an IMG in here. Excuse me if you hear some rustling papers as I get things going here. So you know how to do an IMG, right? So we're going to take that IMG that you downloaded, which should be in the same root folder as this document, and if it is and you named it properly, it's called JAC-600, and then it will appear when we do IMG src equals quotation marks, right? And since we're here, we might as well do alt text at the same time. Alt equals quotation marks, and in the alt text I could put, it's going to be Jack Downs. It's a picture of me. And then in the SRC, we're going to put the name of the image, JAC-600.jpg. Okay, good. This idea of putting a span around an image, which is already in a paragraph, very common idea. No surprise there. Why don't we just put the ID on the IMG? Oh, we could do that, but we'll see in a minute there's reasons to put containers around this. For instance, when we add a caption. Okay, what if, why don't we just forget about these IDs and just have this stuff we're going to do apply to the IMG directly? You're going to have a lot of different IMGs on your pages. You're not going to want to do the same thing to all of them, so we need to have them identified. This one is called Jack. Next one will be called something else, whatever. And then you can, in your styling, you can just address things particularly to that. Remember, IDs become hashtags in CSS, and they are for one-time use on that page. So what we do here is just going to be a one-time thing. There's only one use of this ID on this page is the idea. Okay, so let's save and run it. Hey, and it's me on a bad hair day. Whatever. Okay, maybe that's what I look like when I get up in the morning. So what we got going on here is you're not surprised to see that this image is sitting here at the beginning of the paragraph because that's where it was in the HTML, and then the paragraph continues and other things continues. It's just one thing after another after another. This is the normal flow of HTML. But what if we want that image to behave differently, right? We want that image to float. Go into the text. So let's go ahead and give it a try. So I know I've got that thing with an ID of Jack, so I'm going to go up into the floating area here. Not there, not there. Here it is, hashtag Jack. So let's go ahead and say float left. Our two choices really are left and right. Okay. So we're going to save that. And it did. It floated to the left, and we see the text is now going around it. And all of a sudden, we see that this image is behaving as we generally like images to do on printed pages, have text flowing around them, except that it's all tight in here, right? It says touching. That's pretty ugly. But we have ways to handle that, right? We have margins. So let's go ahead and give this thing some margins. Let's go ahead and we'll also tell it to float to the right. We're going to float it over here. When on this side, we have to deal with the margins on the left side. And actually, just to be safe, we're going to put some margins on the bottom also. But realize that we don't need margins on the side where it's on the edge, which is going out into the margin, right? We don't need to add more margin there because there's nothing touching over here. We're going to move this over to this side and put margins on the left and on the bottom. So let's go float right, and we'll give some margins. Let's do, remember the box model, instead of doing individual margins, let's do 0, top, right, treble, remember the treble method? Bottom is 2EM, 2EM. Okay, good. Let's save it on that. There, that looks much more like you'd like it to be. And if this was your resume and it was just a photo of you and it was obvious it was you, perhaps you wouldn't need any caption. But I think we need to have a caption here. So what are we going to do about a caption? Well, that's going to have to be in the HTML, right? Because that's regular text. So we're going to go down here, find the image. There's the image right there. Okay, right? And let's say we're going to write a caption which says something like, Jack Downs on a bad hair day. Okay, we'll put that in the span itself. Actually, well, obviously, what happens if we don't put it in the span? It's just being part of the paragraph. So it's one of the reasons to have a span, have this container that encompasses the image, is then when we put other things in it, it'll behave with it. It will go together, right? So that's we have to have a caption go along with a photo. It has to be in the same container. So let's write Downs on a bad hair day. Wow, looks like he needs some dental work. Okay, must be all that candy. All right, good. So, okay, we put a caption there. That should be fine, right? Let's run it. Well, something went wrong. Remember when I said in the presentation that to flow properly, text needs width, right? Text needs width. So we're going to have to give this text some width. And how we're going to do that? Let's go back up here to this area, right? Where are we? This area. Here we are. Let's go ahead and we're going to give this some width. And while we're here, By the way, we know this image is 600 pixels wide because I named it with that number, and that's actually one of the other reasons to do it is now we know what we're working with. That's what it is, right? We're going to give it we're going to change the font weight, we're going to change the font size and the line height, all those things all together. Okay, let's go ahead and do some. And this, we could have put that text in its own paragraph too, and then we could have addressed things to that paragraph specifically. That'd be another way to do it. At this point, we just have the text just sitting there. So let's give it width 600 px, and we're gonna we'll apply some things to the text. Font weight bold, and let's do font size. That's not right. Wow. Font size. Text in captions sometimes is a little bigger. It could be a little bigger. We would like it to stand out. That's why we made it bold also. Font size 1.2 EM. And let's say line height. We like the text to be a little closer together too, as opposed to like paragraphs. This text will hang closer together. Let's say it's about 1.2. We don't need a number in there. That's just a little bit bigger than normal. Okay, here we are. So now the text has some width, so it's floating properly. I could, if I thought that was too tight right here, I could add some space in there. I could use the box model to do that. It's respecting the same margins around here because that's actually all applied to the container. And that's a much better way. And that's how you would apply a caption to a photograph and have them both float. Okay, so let's move on to something else. Let me look at my instructions and see what was I going to do next. Oh yeah, the contact information. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. We have some text down in here in the HTML you'll see, and you can see it right here also. It's contact information. It's just sitting there in top of a paragraph. And the point is, we want it to be roughly that position, we're saying, but we want it to act differently. We want it to go down into the text. Oh, by the way, did you notice that one of the properties of floated items is that they do change in kind of respect, in a way, the page width. So as the page width changes, the float is still there. At a certain point, though, the page wouldn't be wide enough for the float, and that would become a problem because this image is set at hard units. But that's how it goes. That's what we're doing at this point. Okay, so we're going to go back in. We have this contact stuff, and I've given something else an ID. And here's the information right here. Another span. This time has an ID of contact. And it is contact me at whatever, or this telephone number. And I could make those things links, but I didn't bother at this point. You know how to make them links. If you decide to use your contact information like this and float it into your text, this is how you would do it. And maybe there's some other text you want to float in someplace, a little box of text in your resume about some other information, and this is how you would float some text in there. So we're going to tell the this stuff to float left, right? However, if we ran this right now, very little will happen. Why? Because we didn't give it width. Remember, text needs width to float. And let's go ahead and say that we're going to give it width of 200 pixels. And I guess we'll stop there for now. Oops, sorry. Okay, so it's sort of, it did float, but it's so hard to see. All this other text is right there, and there's no spacing, and this looks the same. So we have to do other styling to make something like that stand out. And what sort of things would you do? For instance, we could say padding 1 EM. Sorry, let's say, yeah, 1 EM, sure. So 1 letter's width of space on the inside of the box. We could put an actual border on here, but instead I'm just going to use some background color. Background color. Let's say white. Nothing wrong with white or black. Name colors for things like this. Of course, you know the RGBs and the hashtags now, I hope. Margin. We're going to push some text around away from it. Everything except for the left. This is floating to the left, so the left side is fine, right? So we're going to 2em, and we'll stick with that same 2em idea. 2em, 2em, em, and 0. Okay? So this should make it stand out a little bit. So we gave them a white background, we gave them margins, we gave it padding. Remember, the padding is the space on the inside, the margin is the space on the outside. Why is this breaking here? Well, the actual space you get around something depends on the way the lines break too. And again, things would flex with there too, but that's how we float plain text, as you might want to do also. And floating, I would say almost every image in your resume is going to be floated. However, the issue is if you have a very large image and you want to just sit on top of a header, for instance, on top of an H1 or on top of an H2, and you don't want it floated down to text, that is certainly another option. Make it very large, and if you want it to be centered, you have to size it, put it in a div, size the whole thing, and then use margin auto to center it. Remember that. Margin auto centers sized things. But most every image will be smaller, and it'll be floated like this in your text as you go down. Okay, now we got this stuff here. We got these paragraphs. Paragraph left and right. And the idea is we're going to float these and use that to make what was essentially multiple columns, which at this point is a little old-fashioned, but is still very commonly done. So we know that to give this space, to give this page, to make things float, to make text float, we have to have width, right? Now we could use width in hard units here. If we had an overall width for the page, this page has margins of 50 on percentage base though. So we don't have an overall width for the page really, because it just depends on the width of the browser window. But we could use numbers, hard numbers, and then make things sit side by side. But why don't we just use percentages? That makes the most sense here because we're already using percentages for the margins on the page. So here's the idea. We have a left and a right. Okay, good. So I'm going to tell the paragraph on the left to float to the left. But remember, I said that to make something float, if it's text, it needs to have width. But that width can be in percentages. Let's say 47%. Okay, good. And then we're going to say, well, we won't worry about it. We'll just leave it like that for now. And now let's go to the float right. And you'd say, well, we're going to make that float to the right, aren't we? No. Typically, when we have things, multiple things floating side by side, we make them all float the same way. And don't worry, they will go float and float and float. If we had a whole bunch of things, they'd keep on floating side by side as long as there was space. We'll do float left again. And now we'll make it width again, 47%. Why not? I could have just copied and pasted this. So we're going to have some space left over, more than 5% actually. And that's intentional. So our two paragraphs have floated side by side, but what's going on here? This thing that was the footer down below, not really footer, or imaginary footer just to create this situation, but I wanted you to see it, has like flowed up into it along with its color and its text. What's happening? Something's gone terribly wrong. Not really. This should be not that unexpected. When we float, especially floating multiple things, and the next thing in line is affected by it. The next thing in the flow is this footer area, and it will try to come up and jam itself in there. Just floating a single thing into paragraphs that go around it doesn't create that problem. But this is an example where that problem is created. And what we have to do is a clear. We have to do a clear. Now, and we have a thing called footer, we have an ID footer, and we're going to tell it to clear. And here is the ID footer. It already has some styling applied to it, as you see, which is why we're getting that color and so on, right? And we're going to tell it clear both. Now, since we're only using left floats, we could just say clear left. Or we could say clear right, that wouldn't help at all. Those are our three choices, or clear both, left, right, or both. There's seldom much reason not to just say clear both, though, because we usually want to clear all floats. That's what we're doing, clearing the floats on the thing that follows, on the next thing in line. And now it has gone back to behave normally. And we have a little issue here. These things are too close, right? But we had some space left over. Let's put 5% in there to push them away a little bit, right? Good. And we will do that with, we could do this multiple ways, right? So let's go to the one on the left, and we'll do margin right of 5%. Semicolon. Okay. And now we have a little space between them, so nice. And because they're made with percentages, when the page changes width, it gets narrower. These things get narrower also. See, they're flexing. Very nice. And what would happen if this area, this 47 plus 47 plus 5, what if we use some different numbers, and let's say it added up to more than 100? You don't have to do this. You can just watch me. Oh, you can do it if you want to play with it too. In fact, let's make this 15% here. And we have a float dropped. The float dropped because it doesn't have space. There's not room enough there to do it. So that's what we don't want to do. We're going to leave it at 5%. Okay. All right, let's keep on going. And we do the contact information, looking at the instructions. And what else? We do the columns. Let's do some absolute positioning. Good. There's a paragraph, and you'll notice I showed it to you earlier, way down, not really at the very bottom, because we got these other paragraphs, but we have something called a paragraph with an ID of warning. Okay. So we want to make this paragraph move out of the flow completely and go and sit on top of that photograph, right? So how are we going to do that? Well, we know we can get to it with this ID of warning, and we know, by the way, that's just going to be sitting up there. Here we are, ID of warning. There it is, ID of warning. Okay, so I've told you, and I'll tell you again, to float or position text, we need to give it width. You ever go to float or position something and nothing happens? That's probably the issue. You didn't give it width. Images already have width though. And good. Let's make it stand out a little more. Let's give it some padding of 1 EM. Let's give it a color red. It's a warning. So the text will be red. And let's give it a background color. White. Okay, so that should stand out a little more. Let's save and run that. You see, I do have my other curly bracket. It's just down here, lots of space. And we'll go down and see that thing, and there it is. Yes, it is a nice box now, and it says warning, and it's red and so on, but it hasn't moved yet. How do we make it move? Okay, we have to do position absolute. But still, nothing would happen. We have to give it some numbers. Let's say top. This is trial and error numbers, and these numbers are going to be different for you than for me because it's going to actually, to some degree, depend on the width of the browser window, which is actually kind of a problem. But we'll see. Let's say 500. 500 down from the top, this means, and then left, 1200. 1200 over from the left. And those are in pixels. And you could use percentages here. That would be a little more complicated, and usually it's not necessary, but you could use percentages. And it all depends on how this image is working with that containing block. At this point, we have not named a containing block, so the containing block is the entire page, the entire viewport, so to the super home position. Okay, and now we have, geez, look at it, it landed right on top of him. Okay, that's good. And I got lucky on the first try because I guess I've done this before. and you may have to change your numbers a little bit, make it go a little further over or not quite so far over. You can absolutely position something right off the page too. Just make it go way over there, right outside the margins, and not be seen at all. Maybe if you used 3,000 for the left, that would do that. Or you could do negative numbers there too, if for some reason you wanted to go like way over there someplace. But realize that this position is based on this position. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's not. Right now, the problem is, what happens if we make our page go a little narrower? Hey, it's no longer on top of him anymore. What happened? It's because the page is narrow, but this is still 1200 from here. If we wanted to put it right here, then, and because that's where it went, then this wouldn't be a problem. It would always stay right there relative to these things, and that would be fine. So you don't have to do more than this. I just want you to show me that you have positioned this roughly on the photo. When we change these things, that'll change too. It doesn't have to be exactly there. I just want you to see that you've positioned it. You'll see if you want to do the extra credit, you can figure out how to make this this thing here, the block. It's a block. It's a containing block, and you'll actually have to move this warning thing in HTML. You have to move it someplace else to make that work too. It'll have to be in that block. So positioning kind of works great, and then kind of can get more complicated depending on what you're trying to do with it. And you can actually absolutely position a bunch of things like multiple columns and so on, but it's not really necessary to do that sort of thing now that we have Flexbox, which we'll see in a minute. So that's absolute positioning. Most of it. You can read about more and do the extra credit if you wish. Okay, so by the way, if you do extra credit, I want you to first save this for the regular credit and put it in the Dropbox, and then I'm going to make an extra credit Dropbox in case you choose to try it. And that's the key way to see if the extra credit is working. Change the width of the page, and this guy should stay on the image if it's working properly, and this one is not. I'll show you one later that is. Okay, so there we go. We did that. And now we're going to do what? We're going to do flex columns probably, right? Let's see. Absolute positioning. Navigation. Let's do navigation links first. Okay, good. So you see these lists of links, and that's how navigation starts. Navigation is a list. That's why we make it a list. It is a list. Okay? And when things want to be certain type of information, then we give them that structure. We'll skip the flex columns for now. This is the navigation stuff. I have two systems of navigation here. I'm not going to go over them in detail. I'll ask you to look them over. You should be able to figure out most of the things and how they work. One of the big items is one of them, this first one, flexes. And the second one uses floats. Does it? Yeah, it floats. This one's floating. And we see how we get the kinds of things that happen in each one are somewhat similar, but actually the floating one is a little bit more complicated. We have to do this overflow auto here. That's just because of that idea of everything inside a container that floats. Well, maybe I'll show you what happens if we don't do that. And when everything inside a container floats, the container collapses. Collapsing containers, collapsing float. It's different than float drop. So the key floating element here is here, that all those LIs float to the left. But the first one we have, there is no floating in it, you'll see. But you will see this command, display flex. That's the key command. Display commands, you will be reading about those. There's display none, make something disappear. Display block, we're using that here also. That means take something that would normally behave like an inline thing and tell it to behave like a block one. Display block. Display inline is another option. We could take something that's normally block and make it display as inline, depending on the kind of behavior that we want. What we've done here is we've taken the UL, we've given it margin and padding, we've told it to have a list style type of none, so that it's going to remove the bullets, display flex, and justify content center. So we take the UL to become a container around it, and we told it to center all this stuff. Then we did some styling, as all this is. Make the little links behave like blocks, give them a border, give a nice little curve edges, give it some padding, give it some margin. Text decoration none, so no underline on links. Color, you can figure that out. Color, background color, and then we have hover, focus, and we have something called a here. Which is in the Navflex A. So a particular ID inside of an ID, right? Those are working together. That one spot, that one link, give it this other color. That's going to be the link of the page where we are. And we would change that hashtag here and move it to whichever link where we were. Okay? And you'll see if we looked in the HTML, we have a here, an ID here on that. And actually, I've kind of violated some rules here. I have an ID here on the second one too. All right. Anyway, I could make it ID now or this page or something else. All right, so look through those, think about them, think about display and flexing and how we're going to use them, and you'll learn more about flexing soon. I'm going to remove from the first one, I'm going to remove that comment and then remove this comment. Actually, that's not the first one, that's the second one. And I might as well take them both off at the same time. And move this one out, get rid of this one, and save them, and run them. Okay, so what we got here? The first one, I didn't put a background bar on it, but I could have. I've used rounded edges, which you might like or might not. I have a hover on them, and I have a focus too, but you're not seeing it. But that's okay, it's for accessibility. And I have one that just stays a certain color because it's the here one. It still has a hover going on though, which I kind of like that. What this is saying is, this is where you are already, but I'm also getting feedback when I hover. Okay, so it's turning that list of links into something else. Something similar happened on this one, except I used floating instead. There's a little more trial and error in this to make that work. The actual width of this thing is one problem. And then I decided to take this whole div this stuff is in. Is it a div? Or is it just the UL? We'll take a look. And told it to have a background color. So the whole thing has like a bar. So how you style this is all in CSS that you work out for yourself. The key point is whether it's using floating like this one does or using flexing like this one does to make them go side by side and then stay there centered. The centering is a lot easier with the flex one, because as all it is that single center command that we did, which is justify content center. That's what did the whole thing right there. The flexing happened right here from this one thing. We didn't have to go floating everything. We did display flex. Okay, the second one though, I have a hashtag nav, which has got the background color tan. All right, let's take a look in the second one. There's a div called nav which goes around that UL. Okay, good. So what happens if I don't use this command here? Overflow auto. That's the trick command. It doesn't make much sense. Overflow, if you read about it, is something we're not really going to use. It has to do with too much text in a box, and then you let it flow out and go someplace else or something. It's not really that commonly used, but when you apply it to a container where everything floats, you'll have an effect. I'm going to remove that and save this and run it. Okay, what's going on? Well, the problem is that this container, this is that div, is now not held open, right? Because everything inside it, which is this 1, 2, 3, 4 things, is floating. So we want that container, and actually this is allowing other stuff below to come up too, right? I can handle that with a clear. But if I want this container to hold open to push things where they're supposed to be and be able to carry color all the way around it, when everything inside of it floats, I have to use that trick. And this is the trick, overflow auto. And I'll run it. And there, now it stays open. Good. You'll notice that this has been moving around here because I changed the amount of space that things took up with that. And don't worry about it if that moves around on you, unless you want to do the extra credit later. All right, last thing. This is a nice long exercise. We're getting some new ideas. We're going to be using a lot more of this flexing stuff, which has been jammed in here, and the navigation stuff, which are jammed in here also. But that does apply to floating to some degree, at least in this example here. Okay, so we got these two paragraphs down here. I want to make these go side by side again, but I don't want to use floats. I want to use flexes. So how do I do that? Well, let's take a look. It's the last thing we're going to do. Where are those things? There they are. I put a div around both of them called container. It doesn't have to be called container, of course, but by tradition we do put that's often the ID that we give to a container, in which things are going to flex. So I did it here, but you could call it anything you want. And then inside each one of those paragraphs has a div around each one of them, which has a class of flex item. A class of flex item. That's not unusual either. If it was just single paragraphs, we could apply just to that, but it's a paragraph and a heading. That's the problem, right? So how do we grab a paragraph and a heading together? Well, we put a container around them. We might as well put a div around them. And then we have to give it we're going to style each one of those, if there were 20 of them or just 2 of them, the same way. They have to carry this flexing idea. So we will use a class because it's repeated styling. An ID here, and a class here, and a class here. And then how does that work? In the CSS. Here we go. And we're going to go up here. We already have our IDs and classes ready to go. So this is the ID for the container around the whole thing. And these are each of the items inside the container. Right? So all we have to do to the container to make things flex is to tell it to display flex. That's it. Now to make them flex and center, we're going to say justify content center. Sorry, not center. Actually, this one we're going to do space between. That's right. We did the centering on the navigation, but we don't want, this time we don't want those things to be centered, right? We want them to have to flex together on the same line, but to have space between them. And that's actually a choice here. That's how easy that is. You'll read about all these possible choices and many more that we won't even use in the chapter about flexing, Flexbox, as it's called. So, well, let's just see what happened with that. A lot happened, right? In fact, almost everything happened just with those 2 commands. They're side by side. They will stay there. They will flex as things get narrower. See, they're flexing on their own. We didn't have to add percentages or anything. But let's say we do want one of these to be a little smaller to add a little gap in between. Well, there's different ways we could do that. But an easy way to do it is give each of them, make each one a little bit smaller than half. Right? If we make each one 48%, this extra space will be put in between them because of that space between command. We already have space between, so let's make each one a little bit smaller. Let's just make it a width. We didn't, did you notice? We did not have to give things width to flex to begin with. These are text containers, but we didn't give them any width and the flex still worked. There you go. And that did it. We have a little space in between. And of course, the whole thing would flex again. Okay, that's the end of that assignment. And you can save it and zip up that folder and put it in the Dropbox. Now, let's say you want to do the extra credit. The extra credit says, absolute positioning we did doesn't work great. You could make it work better if you read about the containing block information. And I'm going to ask you to do that. And you're going to have to take this text, this warning text, you're going to have to move it in the HTML inside a containing block. You have to make something a containing block. And when you get done, you'd rezip that folder. So essentially you use this again. And then also you would know it worked if when you change the width of the page, the box stayed right on top of the photo. And I have an example of that somewhere. Oh yeah, extra credit one. Okay, I'm using a different picture here. I could change the picture, but I'm too lazy. But same idea. Okay, this is also not a picture of me. Good. Okay, so again, what's the big deal? By the way, you see I have different navigation. That's not even flexing. I wasn't even doing flexing back here. It's before flexing. All right, what's the big deal? It's on top of the photo. We got to be on top of the photo. The problem was when we changed the width of the page. Oh, we changed the width of the page. It stays there. It's because we're using the correct. This is the correct way to use absolute positioning when we don't want it to be relative to the viewport, to the whole window for the superhome position, we want it to be relative to something else. In this case, the container that contains the image, right? And by the way, it looks like I didn't do a caption either. Wow. So therefore, we could take this, you have to do something to it. You have to change the position in the HTML and then name something to be the containing block. And how do you get to know this containing block? Again, if you do that extra credit, you can stick it in the folder just for this extra credit, which should be in the same week area, just down near the bottom.